It's time for the Your Personal Bank Show with Ferenc Toth. In an era of chaos, confusion, and craziness, Ferenc is a voice for common sense. As a financial literacy educator, speaker, and entrepreneur, Ferenc cuts through the noise to help us understand how current events affect our money, economy, and our freedom. Now, here's Ferenc Toth.
Welcome to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ferenc. If you want to contact me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. Again, it's yourpersonalbank.com. Woo-wee, have we had a wild ride in the last, recently in the markets and such. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, you know that this past week or so, we have seen some tremendous volatility in the world stock markets, not just in the U.S. market. In fact, the Nikkei had its worst day like ever, I think. The NASDAQ, of course, did have its worst day ever. And one of these comments that I'm, discussing, and we're going to take a step back. I've had a little time to think about this. Things have settled down some recently. Of course, this is a fast-moving target. So depending on when you listen to this show, because it does air coast to coast, and many people listen online at yourpersonalbank.com. So some of the information may be out of date already. Hopefully not. But again, to take a step back and kind of look at this after having a few days, there certainly was a lot of panic, crisis, and all that kind of stuff. What caused that? First of all, we had an unexpectedly low jobs report. Now, personally, if you listen to the show, you know I've been discussing the jobs numbers for quite some time. I'm going to discuss further in the show some more, where our federal government has been announcing jobs numbers and then restating them a month or two later, much lower, almost every single month. And they've been doing this for over a year. So frankly, it shouldn't be surprised to anybody who's really paying attention. Who's going to believe someone when they repeatedly tell you one thing and then come back and revise the numbers downward every single time? There are never any upward revisions. It's always downward. So we have a pattern. Frankly, they're just playing political games, trying to make things look better than they are. I've stated this before, by painting a rosy picture with the jobs numbers, and then when everyone's paying attention, and then quietly later, a month or two later, revising those numbers down. And the numbers revised down have been significant, nothing small, something like 1 million jobs in a year. It's a huge number. We'll discuss this in more depth. So anyone that was surprised by that, honestly, they're just not paying attention. We had some earnings reports that were not that great. But the big one that really caused the panic, of course, is the yen carry trade, which has now officially busted the AI bubble. This article that states the AI bubble has burst. Here's how we know. And then in the subtitle says, how could we have possibly predicted this? Well, honestly, anyone that's paid attention to any bubble, I mean, about 5 years ago, anything involved with blockchain was a huge bubble that burst. About 20 years ago, it was anything involved, it said .com, the .com bubble. This is nothing new. We had a huge over-exuberance in the AI, the Magnificent Seven, whatever you want to call it, and that has now burst. But what's interesting, what really funded the huge run-up in those tech stocks, other than the hype and exuberance, was cheap funding that mostly came from Japan. And if you don't understand what the yen carry trade was, quite simply, it was Japan was one of the few economies in the world that had not raised interest rates and has not experienced inflation. In fact, the Nikkei hit a high back in the 1980s and has never gotten back, and they've been in a deflationary cycle for the most part ever since. So the interest rates in Japan were super cheap, close to zero, much like what we had here in the U.S. a couple of years ago. So what a lot of the large institutional investors did is they borrowed money from Japan very cheaply and then turned around and invested in U.S. stocks and various things like that. Now, if they had just invested in treasuries or something like that, they probably could have made a 3 or 4, possibly 5% return pretty much without any risk, as long as the interest rate in Japan remained low. The problem is our institutional investors in Wall Street can't stay conservative. They have to also involve leverage, high levels of leverage, margin, and they borrow against assets that vary in value. We talk a lot about positive arbitrage, borrowing against assets here in the Personal Bank Show. But one of the key issues is when you borrow against any asset, borrowing against the underlying asset, ensuring that that is guaranteed, does not change in value, is the key to safety. If the underlying asset changes in value, goes down, and you've borrowed against it, that's where you get in trouble. Well, if you can imagine these institutional investors borrowing money cheaply in Japan, for example, and then investing it in high-flying tech stocks, that's a highly risky trade because you're leveraging against an asset, or you're borrowing to purchase an asset like a tech stock that can vary in value significantly. To make matters worse, then you do it on margin, so there's leverage on top of leverage, folks. Wall Street does this a lot. The 08-09 crash we saw, the bailouts and things like that were a lot of because of this extensive leveraging that was done against assets that varied in value. Well, that's exactly what's happened to Wall Street again. And what triggered it was the Bank of Japan surprisingly raised their interest rates, which means the cost of borrowing went up. Their margin requirements went up with it. In other words, you can only borrow so much. You have to have underlying capital to borrow, to leverage that, which forced a lot of margin calls. Anybody that's invested on margin and has had a margin call understands what I'm talking about. They're not fun. You have to come up with the money in 24 hours. So this all happens very fast, very quickly. Well, apparently this Japanese yen carry trade, in other words, borrowing from Japan to then invest in the U.S. stock market and various things like that, had become very popular over the last 4 years. And we're talking in the tune of like trillions of dollars. And JP Morgan is now stating that although things have settled down from that initial shock we had, that they say that carry trade is only about half done, which means if anybody's looking for a recovery in the market right now, be careful. What JP Morgan is stating is we could see a repeat again of what we saw previously, where markets, the NASDAQ dropped 6% a day, for example. So that's why we see articles here like Reuters saying, goodbye soft landing, hello emergency landing. The leverage and the economic situation is causing the likelihood of a soft landing to be dramatically reduced. See, if we were in a strong, healthy economy, low interest rates, unemployment was not rising, all those kinds of things, yen carry trade, just say the Bank of Japan raised their rates, and it would have caused an impact, but it would have been short-lived, and we probably would have moved on. The problem is the underlying economic situation is also part of the problem. Unemployment is rising. We're going to talk about this more. Like I said, this is a very, very big key. Interest rates are still higher than the Federal Reserve's target, and a lot of people are calling for emergency rate cuts and all these kinds of things. Folks, I think you got another thing coming. You got to be very careful. So here's some of the things. Where are we at now? So what's going on? Well, what the result of some of these things, volatility index, or in other words, the VIX. And the VIX, in the midst of the panic, of the yen carry trade panic, rose above 65, which has only happened two previous times in history. And those two times happened to be right before the 2020 pandemic and the 2008 financial crisis. Very, very big red flag. The bigger concern is something called the Psalm rule. And the Psalm rule is an indicator that tracks unemployment. The Psalm indicator has triggered. Every single time that has triggered, we have gone into recession. In fact, I was talking to some clients. Here's the interesting, folks. My clients are not calling me because I deal in guaranteed, insured, tax-free, guaranteed monies. And I've talked to many of my clients since all this panic occurred. And their statements were, I really feel bad for a lot of people that have lost money, but I know I'm fine. They're not panicking. They're not worried. The people that are calling me that are the ones that have heard me talk about guaranteed money and growth and stuff like that, and want to know if that's still available. So if you want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to discuss with you. yourpersonalbank.com or 866-268-4422. Again, yourpersonalbank.com. But I was talking to one of my clients, and I was just curious. I was like, when did I start talking about the likelihood of a recession occurring? It happened to be in May 23rd of 2023. You can go to yourpersonalbank.com and look at all the previously recorded shows, and that show is still there. I have several years of shows. So it's all documented. And I've been discussing how a recession is likely coming since May of 2023. And at that time, I wasn't saying it was right around the corner. What I was saying is, at that point, there were 6 leading economic indicators, many who had never been wrong. They were all pointing in the same direction, that we were headed towards a recession, and most of the indicators predicted recession somewhere between 6 and 18 months ahead, 15 months from that point in time now. And we're seeing some real jitteriness. Crisis or panic selling, the unwinding of the yen carry trade. What message should that be sending to people? There's no question we're in the late stage of a bull market run. And we are at, or we were at, all-time highs or near all-time highs. When the markets are overpriced at the high end of their range, events are magnified. Crises become magnified. Movements are magnified and accelerated. I think this is a warning shot. This is a major red flag. I do not think there's anything in terms of the leading economic indicators that's substantially changed to cause us to believe that a recession is still not ahead. It's closer than it was last year, certainly, and this is just another warning shot, and you should be prepared for that and be aware of that. I'm going to discuss some other things, in particular unemployment, because this is a very, very big deal, and debt, in terms of why I believe we are far closer to a recession now than we were even 6 months ago. And you should be aware of that. You should protect your portfolio. If you've not done that, or more information, or ask some questions, I can show you how to protect your portfolio, diversify, guarantee some of it with your personal bank, or literally it's the best time in 40 years for annuities because of the higher interest rates. Contact me at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. Again, that's yourpersonalbank.com.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ference. For more information, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. If you want to contact me, it's yourpersonalbank.com. And yes, you will reach me. Again, it's yourpersonalbank.com. So we're going to discuss the Psalm rule. This is a huge indicator because this deals with unemployment. And why you should be paying attention to this, folks, is because it's never, ever been wrong. What is the Psalm rule? Well, it basically signals when the U.S. is in a recession, and it's about a 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate. If the unemployment rate rises by 0.5% or more relative to where it was averaging 12 months prior, it signals recession. It is now triggered. And again, the reason why this is so important is every single time the Psalm indicator has triggered since 1960, we have had a recession, or we have been in recession. You see, the U.S. unemployment rate has actually risen for 4 consecutive months, which is the longest streak since the 2008 financial crisis. Here's another key point to think about in terms of unemployment, because again, unemployment has been the one bright spot. Employment has been one of the bright spots. Consumer spending and employment have been the bright spots in the U.S. economy, preventing us from falling into recession. And I stated, if we see unemployment going up, that's sort of the last shoe to drop. And the other one is consumer spending. Those are the last two shoes. I'm going to get to that one next. But this is another key part about unemployment that you should be aware of. Over the past 75 years, every time unemployment rose for 4 consecutive months, the U.S. economy entered recession. We have just done that. Unemployment has now risen for 4 consecutive months. That the U.S. labor market is contracting. And this is bad news for the economy. Every single time for the last 75 years has led to a recession. U.S. job numbers were overstated Q3 and Q4 of 2023 by nearly 1 million jobs. Our government, for the past year and a half or so, has been overstating jobs reports nearly every single month, and then very quietly, a month or two later, when nobody's paying attention, they hope, revising those numbers downward. And just in the 6 months of last year, of 2023, the total revisions have added up to almost 1 million less jobs. The U.S. economy is rapidly slowing down. The two bright spots in our economy has been unemployment and consumer spending. Those have been the two areas that have kept us afloat. Unemployment is increasing, continuing to do so. The economy is slowing down. What else? What is happening with consumer spending? 2.1 trillion of U.S. excess savings were spent in the past 3 years. You see, the federal government helicoptered in over $2 trillion of COVID relief funds that increased the savings that that Americans had by some of the highest levels we've ever seen. So American consumers had an extra $2 trillion to spend basically over their normal savings levels. In other words, there's a historical norm or average savings level that we've had for decades. We were well above that average because of all the excess COVID relief funds, excess savings. Well, it turns out not only in the past 3 years have Americans spent the $2 trillion of excess savings, which is all economic activity, kept unemployment low, kept the economy going and all that. But in fact, Americans have gotten used to spending more and actually are now negative 170 billion from the normal savings levels. So now cumulative excess savings are now negative 170 billion. So we went from a 2.1 trillion excess to a 170 billion negative. Serious delinquencies, by the way, 90 days plus for credit card debt has now spiked to over 10%, which is the highest level in 12 years. Consumer spending and debt go hand in hand. And it turns out now total U.S. household debt has increased to a new record of almost $18 trillion, according to the New York Fed. Mortgage debt has increased. Auto loans, student loans are the only one that's gone down a little bit. Credit card debt has jumped quite a bit. Total household debt in the U.S. is now up about 25% in the past 3 years and has hit a record high for 4 straight quarters. What does that tell us? Average cost of goods and services are up about 25% in the past 3 years. In other words, Americans are fighting inflation with debt. How long can that continue? Obviously, not indefinitely. And to make matters even worse, it's not just consumers that are struggling with debt, but this is also U.S. banks are experiencing significant shifts due to higher interest rates, particularly your mid and small banks, because of the unrealized losses on banks' portfolios due to commercial real estate. You see, when office spaces and retail spaces were not used as much anymore due to the COVID shutdowns, a lot of people have not gone back to the office to work. Companies don't need the office space that they used to. Small and medium-sized banks predominantly handle most of the commercial loans. Let me give you an example. Let's say you bought a commercial office building and you got a loan for it, like most landlords, owners do. Commercial lending doesn't work like residential lending typically. Usually you get a loan at the current interest rates, typically for a 3-year period. And then your loan adjusts based on the current interest rates. So if you got a loan 2 or 3 years ago on a commercial building, your interest rates were quite low. Now your loan is coming up for renewal, so to speak, the interest that is. It's a variable rate. Interest rates are roughly double, which means your interest on your payment will be roughly double. At the same time, many commercial buildings are at record vacancy rates because companies are not leasing office space as much as they used to. Retail stores, there aren't as many of them as there were. So now you have significant vacancies, your income is less, and your payments have now just gone up significantly. There is somewhere of around $1 trillion, they're stating, in loans. They're going to be coming due in the next couple of years in the commercial real estate arena. This is a crisis level event, folks, and this will impact the economy. There's no way, two ways around it. But before we get done, I just want to share a few other facts to share where we're at. Inflation has been above 3% for 39 straight months. A record number of Americans are working multiple jobs. Somewhere around 10% of credit card balances are becoming delinquent. Housing affordability, of course, is still at near record highs. Mortgage demand is at its lowest level in 30 years. This is not what is called a soft landing. And a lot of people are asking, what should we do? Well, one of the things I always say is, in uncertain times, protect yourself, which is exactly what Warren Buffett is doing. He's known as the Oracle of Omaha, considered the greatest investor in history. He has an unprecedented level of cash. He has sold more stocks in the past quarter than at any point in his 60-plus year investing career. That should tell you something. Warren Buffett is speaking with his wallet. In fact, Berkshire Hathaway currently now owns more bonds, treasury bills, than the Federal Reserve does. That is shocking when you think about it. And again, Warren Buffett has always been very optimistic about the U.S. economy, but his pocketbook is not saying not so much anymore. And he's been stating that also. He feels like things are way overpriced. He's discussed a market crash. He's sitting on more cash than at any point in his entire investing career. And he has bought treasuries, which are guaranteed interest rate bonds, at the highest levels that he ever has in his career. In fact, he owns more than the Federal Reserve. That's saying something. And for those of you that are looking for the Fed to bail everyone out, Jerome Powell has recently stated that it's not the Fed's job to make the stock market comfortable. It's not. A lot of people were asked. There was a study recently put out. They were asking, if the Fed had a choice between inflation or recession, which would they choose? And the majority responded said, well, they would try to avoid a recession. And that's the wrong answer. Again, those of you listening to the show know that I was chairman of the board of a bank for a couple of years. So I was inside the banking world for a while. The Federal Reserve's mandate is quite simple. Number one, keep inflation manageable. And two, they want to keep employment at decent levels. But the reality is they're more concerned about inflation because they're economists. They understand inflation destroys people's purchasing power. Inflation destroys countries, folks. It's that simple. Look at Wehrmacht Germany. Great historical example. There's many, many others. Recessions are painful. People don't like recessions. But actually, from an economist standpoint, recessions are actually healthy. What they do is they wash out the excesses. The companies that probably shouldn't be in business in a low interest rate environment, when now it moves to a higher interest rate environment and they're struggling, probably should be washed out. The excesses in the system. Remember, I think it was Fed Chair Bernanke or one of them, I can't remember now, who was famous for saying irrational exuberance back in the dot-com bubble. The Federal Reserve doesn't like aggressive speculation in the markets. In fact, they prefer to wash it out. So those that are calling for emergency rate cuts and all that type of thing, I'm not going to say the Fed's not going to reduce interest rates this year, but I highly doubt it. And they really don't understand the Fed's role or their goal. And also what Jerome Powell has repeatedly stated, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that they don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 1970s. And if you go back in history and look at that, what he means is the Fed moved too quickly to reduce rates after trying to kill inflation, and it kept coming back. In fact, inflation kept coming back, and they finally didn't kill it until the late 70s, where they raised the federal funds rate to like 18 or 20% and finally killed it dead. But it took a decade. They don't want to repeat that same mistake. They don't want to move too quickly to reduce rates. And even though Wall Street is calling for it and repeatedly crying for Rate cuts, if you look at history, right now where we're at is about average over the last 60, 70 years, interest rates. And inflation is still higher than their target rate of 2%. Why would the Fed cut rates? They have no reason to. Yes, unemployment has gone up a little bit, but it's still in manageable levels. It's still in the low fours. Inflation is a far bigger concern. Stay tuned in the next segment. I'm going to share some more about some insights about the Federal Reserve and why I believe it's unlikely that we'll see any kind of significant rate cut this year.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ference. For more information, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. If you want to contact me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. And yes, you will reach me at yourpersonalbank.com. So in the last segment, I was finishing up on a thought that I need to expand upon further, and that is when we have the crisis in the markets, all of a sudden we started hearing about people saying the Fed needs to cut rates, the Fed needs to do an emergency cut rate. I mean, I even heard crazy things like emergency rate cut is 75 basis points and all that. Well, for one, folks, do you understand that inflation is still higher than the Fed target rate, which is their number one mandate? So why would they lower rates? Because if they lower rates, that'll just throw gas back on the inflation fire, which is the number one thing they're wanting to avoid. They also want to keep unemployment at manageable levels. And although, yes, it's gone up, it's still in the low fours. So it's still at historically low levels. So there's plenty of room for unemployment to rise before it becomes an issue or a crisis. Thirdly, Jerome Powell has repeatedly stated that the Fed does not want to repeat the mistakes of the 1970s. Several times in the 1970s, when it looked like the Fed, they would raise rates, look like they got inflation pretty much under control, would lower rates again, and inflation would come back. And this process, this cycle repeated itself several times, and it took an entire decade for them to finally kill inflation by raising interest rates to 20%. I mean, killed it dead. We had a horrendous economy at the time, but they had to finally do that to kill it. They don't want to make that same mistake. So the Fed has historically always been slow to move, late to the party. And lastly, this is a quote from Federal Reserve Chair Powell, it's not the Fed's job to make the stock market comfortable. He's right. The Fed is not in favor of aggressive speculation, and that's what has absolutely happened, particularly in this tech stock. It was a bubble, folks. And part of that bubble, part of it was hype. I've been stating that for a long time on the show. And part of it was from cheap borrowing money from Japan to finance it, almost free money to throw it at the market. That's not the kind of thing the Fed is in favor of or will encourage or support, no matter what Wall Street wants. And see, the Fed, here's the other thing you need to understand from their standpoint. Again, I was on a bank board. I was a chairman of the bank board. I was inside in the banking world for a while. Bankers are pretty conservative. The Fed understands right now it's in a lose-lose situation. You see, if the Fed cuts rates aggressively right now, markets will likely tank further because then everybody will say, well, panic because they're saying, what's wrong? Why are they dropping rates so much? In fact, almost every time you look at a Fed rate cut of, say, half a point or more, markets usually tank because it's usually bad news is why the Fed's doing that, bad economic news. Also, inflation will likely, there'll be a resurgence and it'll reignite inflation to higher levels, and it's already currently higher than they want it to be, their target rate of 2%. Now, the Fed doesn't cut rates. Recession fears will continue to mount, granted. But understand something. A recession actually helps the Fed in its fight with inflation. They don't want to say this out loud because they don't want to say out loud that they want a recession or they want more employment, but they understand that what is a recession? It's a slowdown in economic activity, right? Less demand. Well, what is inflation? too much demand, too much dollars chasing too few products and services. Well, if you have less demand, guess what? You have less inflation. A recession actually cures the Fed's number one concern. And that is the real reason why we're far more likely to go into recession, and the Fed will act slowly to make sure inflation is dead before they start to lower interest rates. They're far less fearful of a recession than inflation. And by the way, no matter what they say, the Fed is political. I mean, the Fed chair is appointed by the president, so there's political considerations involved. But if there is a recession and then the Fed comes in and lowers rates, they can be the white horse. They can come in and rescue the situation and look good. If they drop rates too soon, inflation goes back up. Everybody's pissed at the Fed, just like they were last time because they were too slow to act and ended up 9% inflation rate at one point a couple of years ago because they were so slow to act. I was one of them being very, very negative on the Fed because of their slowness of acting. So those are a number of reasons why, no matter what you're hearing from the legacy media, Wall Street, I know what they want, and they're advocating for lower rates because it's good for the stock market in general and all those kinds of things. I understand that, but that's not the Fed's mandate, their goal, or their focus. So frankly, if we see rate cuts in 2024 from the Federal Reserve, any rate cut, I would be surprised. I'm not saying there's not going to be one at all, but I would be very surprised. I personally don't believe, unless something significant changes, that we'll see any rate cuts this year. It'll be sometime in 2025, most likely at this point. The Fed's going to want to make sure inflation, it's kind of like, you remember those Smokey the Bear ads, in the campfires? You want to make sure the fire is out, and you want to make sure it's dead out. I mean, you want to pour water or dirt on it and make sure there's no smoke. I mean, that fire is out. It's dead. There's no question about it. That's kind of the philosophy of the Federal Reserve. They want to make sure that inflation monster is, because it's hard. Once it comes out of the genie, it's hard, that bottle, it's hard to put back in. It's really difficult to put back in. We're seeing that. So when they get a handle on it, and they're getting closer to it, to be fair, well, then when they realizing, hey, it's where we want it to be, and it's pretty much dead, they want to make sure it's dead out, just like Smokey the Bear, before they're going to play with reducing rates. And if they do anything outside of that, I would be highly, highly surprised. Now, here's another thing, too. I find this ironic. So many people automatically think that a rate cut, at some point there will be a rate cut, most likely. And when that does happen, most people I'm surprised by how many people think, oh my gosh, we get a rate cut and boom, the markets are going to go back up. That's not actually necessarily the case. In fact, if you go back in history and you look at throughout all the different times when the Fed then started to do the first rate cut, historically, the first couple months after the first rate cut, the S&P was pretty flat. If the economy did not go into recession after a rate cut, then there was a gain in the S&P for the next year on average of about 10%. This is historical averages. However, and this isn't the case most of the time, when the Fed does a rate cut, it's because we are now in a recession. And by the way, what does the S&P 500 do typically? A year after the first rate cut, and in that process, we end up going into recession, on average a 15% decline in the S&P. So folks, a rate cut is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, most of the time it's a bad thing. And that's why is the Fed cutting rates? Because we're in a recession. And they're not going to cut rates, as I stated earlier, too soon because they don't want to reignite inflation. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Now, what do? Reduce your risk, reduce your market risk, protect your portfolio, get into guaranteed assets. Your personal bank's one of those. Annuities is another great one. You can do CDs. Bonds can be an arena. You want to be in interest rate sensitive assets because interest rates are higher for longer, which is also another mantra we've been hearing from the Fed for a long time. Those are the types of assets that thrive. Now, getting into things like CDs or bonds sometimes can be difficult. Depends on the size of your portfolio. Plus, you can get locked up. Annuities, you, of course, can lock up your principal. So some people don't want to go there because maybe they want to reinvest in the markets when things do get better, which they will at some point. And that's where your personal bank really shines, because you can have up to 85% liquidity on your money day one. So literally, you can grow your money up to 6%, insured, guaranteed, tax-free right now, increasing dividends starting next year, likely for the next several years. Park your money, earn a decent return on it, guarantees, tax-free, highly liquid. And then when we have that correction, that recession that's bound to happen at some point in the relatively near future, all the factors, economic indicators and red flags, including this latest crisis, I think is just another red flag, another warning sign. Correction does occur. You can then access funds from your personal bank policy, re-engage in the market, and buy stuff on the cheap if that's what you want to do, instead of riding the roller coaster down, which unfortunately is what most people do. They bury their head in the sand and they just ride the roller coaster up or down sideways. I can tell you a lot of institutional investors don't. All the big boys don't. All the wealthy families, they don't. That's what you hear them say. I'm telling you, but just telling you from being on the inside, being on a bank board for a couple of years, I'm telling you, they don't just, for the most part, sit back and just let things happen to them. They're not that passive. In other words, they move to cash. And if you want to prove it, I stated in the last segment, Warren Buffett, sitting on more cash than he ever has as an entire investing career. That's over 60 years for it, folks. That's the Oracle of Omaha. Well considered one of the best investors in history. He's not doing that. He's moving to cash. Heck, he sold half of his shares in Apple. I think most people agree Apple's a good company. And even if we go into a hard recession, I believe Apple will survive and still be in business. I don't think they're going anywhere. It's a high likelihood that after a correction occurs, he can pick up Apple shares for a lot cheaper than where they are now. That's what he's betting on, I'm sure. Why not follow the example of proven experts like Warren Buffett? Now, he went and bought treasuries. He's an institutional investor. He can do that. The average individual can't go to the bond market and buy treasuries. I get that. Well, that's where your personal bank can come into play, because that's what the insurance companies invest in. They're institutional buyers that do that for you and then give you the additional advantage of guarantees and tax-free and high liquidity. So you can take advantage of the same opportunities, get similar returns to like Warren Buffett is getting with his treasuries, if not more, because insurance companies also have profits. They pay dividends. Dividends, of course, are profits of a company. You could quite likely be receiving a higher return than even Warren Buffett is on his treasuries, yet be liquid like he is, nimble and ready for when that next correction occurs to take advantage of that. If any of that makes any sense to you, I can help you accomplish it. Contact me at yourpersonalbank.com or 866-268-4422. Again, yourpersonalbank.com will be happy to help you set yourself up to thrive in this economic uncertainty. I don't think it's going to get any less volatile in the near future. Most people are saying the rest of this year is going to be pretty darn volatile. So why ride the roller coaster if you don't have to? Warren Buffett isn't. Why should you? Stay tuned in the last segment. I got a few other things that I think you're going to find interesting and some solutions too. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ference. For more information, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. If you want to reach me, contact me at yourpersonalbank.com. Again, it's Ference, yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. So I've got a few current events, political issues that I need to address. I've been discussing a lot of financial stuff, particularly on this show for obvious reasons. There's been a lot of stuff going on. The markets have gone crazy. If you missed what I was sharing earlier, go to yourpersonalbank.com. You can listen to this or any of the previously recorded shows. I think you'll find it very, very illuminating in terms of understanding what happened, the crisis that happened, why, what's likely to happen, and some of the reasons why, what's going on within debt, unemployment, all those things, the likelihood of recession, all of that. I encourage you, go to the website, yourpersonalbank.com, check it out. Contact me if you have more questions or want to discuss your situation further. Now, I'm going to share a few things that are going to probably piss off some people. It certainly pisses me off. But there was an illegal alien who went to the store and had bought some stuff, and they accidentally left their receipt. And this cashier made a copy of it and then posted it. And if you're not pissed off, you should be. This is an illegal alien food stamp. Their balance is over $13,000. They also have a cash balance of over $4,000. And then they had a second food stamp balance of over $4,000 with a cash balance of over $3,000. This one person had, 25 grand or so in unspent money. Who knows how much they actually received? This is the amount of money they had not spent on food or housing or whatever. These were cash balances in essence, their debit card. Guess where that money comes from? Citizens, taxpayers, or, as the government often does, print more if they don't have it. We're paying for this, folks. And if we're not paying for it directly with our tax monies, we're paying for it in inflation. Again, inflation has been over 3% for 39 months straight in a row. That's why the cost of things are 25, 35, 50% more than they were 3-4 years ago. And we're paying for this. Well, let me give you another reason that if you're not angry already, you should be. The U.S. government has accidentally, quote unquote, sent at least $239 million in development assistance to the Taliban since 2020. And the reason, this is public record, public knowledge, it's due to the State Department's failure to properly vet award recipients. Hard-earned tax dollars, over $200 million of it, has gone to the Taliban. Well, they're not our friends. Ukraine, of course, has received over $100 billion. Iran, of course, had billions unfrozen that was being held by the U.S. Many student loans have been forgiven, mostly to Democrat voters. Of course, all of these handouts are funded by the U.S. taxpayer or extra printing of dollars, which means we all pay more due to inflation. To make things, this one pisses me off because this one kind of hits close to home. I'm a veteran. Well, there's a law now that has forced over 120,000 vets to return payments that they received when they received leaving the military, mostly disability and separation payments. And it is forcing some vets, disabled and senior vets, into poverty. I'm sorry, but the one group of people that deserve our support more than any other, in my opinion, are veterans. They're the ones that protect our freedoms. And for them to be put last in line and be forced to pay back money to the U.S. government while it accidentally, quote unquote, gives hundreds of millions of dollars to the Taliban, hundreds of billions to the Ukraine, I'm sorry. Student loan forgiveness, I'm sorry, that should be far, far down the list. That's if we were financially and economically in strong position and didn't have much debt. We got record debt, 35 trillion, right? This is one of the scummiest scumbag moves I've heard of in a very, very long time. This does not represent my country. It makes me angry. I'm ashamed. It makes me angry that my tax dollars go to things like the Taliban and countries that hate us, and yet our veterans get thrown out, have to pay their money back. Illegals getting free housing, food, health care, food stamps, government phones. It just pisses me off that our money, our hard-earned tax dollars, are going to these things. It makes you wonder why. Why are we Why are we paying into the system? Why? What benefit is this government giving us citizens? I just don't understand. Where's our representation? We have an opportunity coming up. I get it, and very much looking forward to it. Gosh, I hope enough people have woken up to realize what is really going on, that our federal government, for the most part, is not representing citizens or our interests, is spending us into oblivion, throwing money away, and giving it away to literally enemies like the Taliban of all places. I don't understand. It's frustrates the tar out of me. And I had a listener reach out to me last week, and I thought this was very pertinent. I really appreciate them listening and reaching out to me because one, I know they're listening, obviously, and two, I struck a chord and it opened up a conversation, and that is what I always appreciate. And their question to me was, and I was discussing this kind of very point, is he said he was listening to my program for the first time, and I hear me complain about sending money to foreign countries, and he said to himself, Ukraine, and 2 minutes later, I was complaining about Zelensky and Ukraine. And then his question for me was, as a religious conservative, which I am a Christian. I strongly state that. It's an important part of my life. I am conservative. I don't deny that fact. But he says, would you mind as a country discontinue all foreign disbursements and keeping our money at home? No, I wouldn't, actually, for the most part, and stay out of everyone's business and conflicts. I would much prefer that. And if so, can we include, he's talking about Israel in the list, and really got into the religious aspects of it. And I thought it was interesting because, in my opinion, I felt like it was overly focusing on the religious aspect. And my response was this. In general, I am against giving money or support to other countries unless there's a strong strategic interest or they're an ally of the U.S., especially as we incur more debt. This becomes more critical. And although I don't support Russia invading Ukraine, I'm against support for Ukraine for a number of reasons. They're not a member of NATO. They're not an ally. They're not a democracy. Elections have been canceled. My opinion, it's mostly a civil war. I am half Hungarian. I have relatives that still live in Western Ukraine right now. And in those parts of the world, they've been fighting for centuries, folks. And most of Eastern Ukraine happens to be Russian ethnically. They speak Russian. And there's been referendums for Eastern Ukraine wanting to be part of Russia. Historically, they've been part of Russia, and even until recently. So, but most importantly, the parts that bothers me is, I feel it's unacceptable to support protecting other countries' borders, while ours remains open. I find that egregious. That's unacceptable. I don't like our country being involved in endless wars. As a U.S. citizen, I do not believe that's in our best interest. Israel, of course, a little different. Now, I don't consider them because of Christian or religious reasons regarding foreign aid. It's really more of a practical matter. They are an ally of the U.S., and U.S. does have strategic interest in the Middle East. And the main reason, folks, is oil. Let's be real. If we didn't need their oil, we really wouldn't care about the Middle East, would we? And it would be a whole nother discussion. Until we're energy independent, which would be the solution, which we could be. We have enough reserves. We could be energy independent. We could be again. But since Israel is the only democracy in the region, it makes sense for them to be our ally. And again, it would be much less of an issue if we were energy independent. That would solve a lot of problems, and we wouldn't have to be so involved. As I finished up my response to this listener, which again, I appreciate him reaching out to me, I would prefer the U.S. to focus on our needs before supporting other countries, especially given the fact we have a government that spends far too much money and we have far too much debt. Our debt and the interest on the debt is increasing to unsustainable levels. It's accelerating exponentially. And this is going to cause economic devastation if it's not addressed soon. I believe if we don't turn this ship soon, it's like the Titanic. We see the iceberg, we're headed to it. Are we going to turn, and are we going to turn in time? If we don't, I believe this next economic crisis will be known as a debt crisis because it'll be caused by too much spending and too much debt. I finished up the response with this, and I think this is part of the solution. George Washington warned against foreign entanglements in his farewell address. So did Dwight D. Eisenhower. He warned against the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. Both of these great presidents were correct. We should be very, very careful about getting involved in foreign entanglements. We should be very selective, only in our strategic interest. No matter what, take care of our own needs first. We should take care of our own vets before we send money, quote unquote, accidentally to the Taliban or to Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter. As always, stay tuned to the Your Personal Bank Show next week for more great information. Contact me if you want assistance on how to thrive in this economic uncertainty we're dealing with. And as long as it's on our money, in God we trust.
Listen Tuesdays at noon and Saturdays at 1 to the Your Personal Bank Show for more information. Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. This show is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information. The presenter and guests of this program do not engage in legal, accounting, or tax advice. Professional advice regarding your situation should be sought if required. Some products discussed may have limitations and not be available in all states. Excessive unpaid loans may affect performance. Distributions may become taxable if not managed properly. Replacements may not be suitable for everyone. There may be charges when replacing coverage. Dividend rates and bank line of credit rates may change. For current rates, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. Again, that's 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com.